We are back on the record in the state of Arizona versus Ramon Bueno, CR 2014-149887-001. Let the record reflect the presence of counsel and the defendant. Is there anything we need to address before we bring in the jury?
No, Your Honor.
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. Let's bring the jury in, please. Ms. Dahl, would you like to have the witness return to the witness stand? Please be seated. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch break. We will continue with the direct examination of the witness. Ms. Dahl, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Trooper Cruz, I believe where we left off is that you were responding from the DPS officer over on Encanto, a couple miles from where the traffic stop had occurred with Trooper Casey. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you were in the one-man unit or marked unit yourself.
Yes.
Where was the traffic stop at?
The traffic stop was inside the parking for the Nights Inn Hotel.
And is that at the I-17 and approximately McDowell Road along the frontage road there?
Yes, it's on the southbound frontage road, and it's just north of McDowell Road.
Is that here in Maricopa County?
Yes, it is.
So tell us what you did when you pulled up in your vehicle. What did you see?
When I arrived on scene, Trooper Casey had completed had made the traffic stop, and the vehicle had stopped in the parking lot that runs parallel with the southbound frontage road. He had positioned his patrol vehicle approximately 8 to 10 feet behind the vehicle.
Before we go any further, I'm going to ask you this. It's a common question. Do you have dash cams, or did you have dash cams back in October of 2014 on these DPS vehicles?
No, my vehicle did not have a dash cam.
What about Trooper Casey's?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
What about Trooper Alfano's?
No either. He did not have one also.
So you parked where?
So Trooper Casey, when the vehicle came to a stop, there's a fire lane curb that's dividing a grass area from the frontage road to the parking lot. The vehicle had stopped adjacent to that fire curb, and Trooper Casey had parked next to that. So I positioned my vehicle to the right side of Trooper Casey's vehicle.
Would that be the west side of Trooper Casey's vehicle?
Yes.
What did you see?
As
What type of vehicle was it?
It was a blue vehicle, kind of a dark blue vehicle. As I pulled up, I noticed the windows were very dark. Trooper Casey had his takedown lights activated.
What are takedown lights?
Takedown lights on our vehicles, we have an emergency light bar that will have red and blue flashing lights. Our lights had 3 functions. Once you make that stop, if you turn it on to a takedown light, it eliminates all the red and blues except for the 2 outside lights on either end, which will flash solid red. There's also a 3rd function, which is a floodlight, which turns all the lights completely white. I do not remember at this moment if he had his floodlights or takedown lights, but both of those versions illuminate incredibly bright. So when I pulled up, I noticed he had his lights activated, and I could not see inside the vehicle.
What were the lighting conditions like back on October 8th of 2014 in the parking area of the Nights Inn?
There was a lot of ambient light due to the area and the proximity to Interstate 17. So there was a lot of street light coming in, and the surrounding area between hotel lights and street lights was eliminated rather well for it being nighttime.
Did you see people milling around at that time?
No, there was nobody else in the area.
You mentioned that the tint on the windows was very dark, is that correct?
Yes.
That had been stopped? Could you see into the vehicle?
I could not see any of the occupants. So when I brought my vehicle to a complete stop, I activated my floodlights, which is the setting where it's more powerful and all the lights are eliminated in white.
At that point, or at any point, during this interaction, could you see into the Mercury Sable?
No, I could not, even with my floodlights activated.
Was Trooper Alfano already there?
No, Trooper Alfano arrived a short time later. I do not remember exactly how long after I arrived.
So you pull up, you pull to the west. What did you do next?
I immediately opened my door, left it open, and I stepped out, approached Troopers Casey's passenger side front window, which he lowered so he could talk to me. Well, he was sitting inside his vehicle when I arrived.
What did he say to you, if anything?
Trooper Casey informed me he had 5 occupants in the vehicle. 3 of them he'd been able to identify, and 2 of them he believed had given him false information.
What did you do next?
At that point, I began to put my patrol gloves on. I wear leather gloves, and I told Casey when he was ready we would reapproach the vehicle.
What happened next?
Somewhere during this interaction is when Trooper Alfano arrived, and he came walking up behind me, asked what was going on. I said something to the effect of, we have 2 people giving false information, so we're going to have to take them out of the vehicle.
Was it two people giving false information or 3?
That I remember, it was 2 people giving false information.
So could it have been that 3 didn't have ID, but 1 gave her true name?
Correct.
What did you do next?
At that point, Trooper Casey began to tell me what names they'd given. In all honesty, I did not listen exactly to what names he was repeating. Instead, I asked him which occupants he were. He told me there was 2 male occupants in the vehicle. Both of them were sitting in the rear of the vehicle. One was sitting directly behind the driver, and the other occupant was sitting directly behind the passenger, and there was a female in between them.
What did you do next?
I told Trooper Casey to go ahead and do his approach. What that means is he's going to approach the original person he was talking to, which would be the passenger sitting behind the driver, and I told him I would take care of the other male who was sitting on the passenger side rear.
Now, at this time, were the windows up on the passenger side, front and back, or were they both down or a mix?
So from my vantage point, I could only see the passenger side of the vehicle, and both the front and rear window were both up in the closed position.
What did you do next?
Once Trooper Casey was ready, we approached the vehicle at the same time, and I immediately went to the passenger side of the vehicle and stood next to the rear passenger window.
Did you have your firearm out?
No, I did not. It was holstered.
What about Officer Casey?
He had a notepad in his hand. I believe he was holding it in his left hand.
What about Officer Alfano?
Trooper Alfano initially walked up behind me, and once I came to a stop, I motioned for him to go around the vehicle over to Trooper Casey, which he did.
And where did he position himself?
Trooper Alfano was facing Casey, so he stood on the driver's side of the vehicle towards the trunk area, looking at Trooper Casey.
Did you hear Trooper Casey and what he was saying to the occupants of the car?
I could vaguely hear his conversation. It was something to the effect of, I know you're giving me false information. If you have warrants, I'm just going to one-roll you, so just give me your real name.
Could you hear what was being conveyed back from the occupants of the vehicle?
I could not hear anything the passenger inside the vehicle was saying.
What happened next?
At that point, my main duty as the second officer on scene is to worry about that passenger. So I had taken out my flashlight because I could not see in the vehicle, and I put the flashlight up against the window, and I could not see inside the window. This causes quite a bit of concern for me, and I literally put my flashlight up against the glass of the window and started moving it in an up and down manner to try to see if I could see inside the vehicle, which I couldn't. This caused me concern, so I slowly put my hand up on the roof of the vehicle and curled my flashlight down, and I moved the rest of my body to what's referred as the C-pillar. That's the back metal portion of the vehicle that leads down to the trunk. Just based on my experience, I wanted some cover for my body because I could not see inside the vehicle.
Were you on high alert at this time?
Due to the fact that I couldn't see inside the vehicle, yes, I was I was on high alert, for lack of a better word.
Tell us what happened next.
At that point, I heard Trooper Casey say something to the effect of, well, if that's your name, give me your social or social security number. At that moment, Trooper Casey, who appeared to have been standing approximately a foot away from the vehicle, took a step towards the vehicle, and I saw his left hand move up, which I took as him bringing up his notepad to write something down. I felt a little sense of relief thinking, okay, the subject's going to cooperate. And the very next instant, Trooper Casey tilted his head down to, I presume, write the information that he thought he was about to receive.
What happened next?
That moment, I heard a incredibly loud sound, and I saw a muzzle blast engulf his head. And what I refer to a muzzle flash is the flame that comes out of a handgun after it's been fired. It completely engulfed his face, and he disappeared.
Where was that muzzle flash near?
The muzzle flash came directly out of the vehicle. From my vantage point, it appeared to be no less than a foot away from his face.
What did you see and hear next?
So I wore an earpiece on my right ear. The initial gunshot was so loud, it caused my left ear. I had struggled to hear, so everything became very muffled. After the muzzle flash, I saw Trooper Casey disappear. And what I mean by disappear is body went down.
What did you do?
That moment, it took me a split second to react. Based on my Marine Corps training in the infantry, we referred to that as a pink mist. Pink mist is somebody taking a headshot. There's nothing left. So it took me a split second to react to the gunshot and what I just seen. Because I had been leaning against the vehicle, I had to push off with my left arm, and the only way to push off was to circle around to my right. So I basically spun around to my right to try to create distance, but I was still too close to the vehicle to shoot. I perceived there was a threat coming from that left side of the vehicle, and I was in fear for my life and Trooper Alfano, who was standing no less than a foot away from where Trooper Casey had been. So I took out my gun and I began to fire into the left rear window where I believed the threat was coming from, who would be the subject sitting behind the driver.
Now, you didn't know at that time whether the shooter was going to start shooting other people within the vehicle, correct?
Correct. When the initial shot rang out,
You don't know if there would be another shot toward Officer Casey, who is now on the ground, right?
correct.
Or shots toward you or Officer Alfano, is that right?
That's correct.
Is that why you shot?
Yes.
Were you scared?
Yes, I was.
What did you do next?
So I had to create distance between the time I pushed off, turned around, pushed off a second time, and began to fire. I did not see the vehicle begin to move yet. I took that as a sign that whoever had shot was possibly either trying to shoot Trooper Casey, who I believed was on the ground at that point, or continue shooting at us. So I began to shoot, and I did what's called a tactical retreat, which I walked backwards towards my vehicle and fired towards the vehicle.
Could you see the backdrop?
I could see the backdrop, and I remember it being a clear backdrop. What I mean by a clear backdrop is I did not have any other vehicles, civilians, or anybody else that could be in danger in case I was to miss my intended target.
Were you aware of what Officer Alfano was doing, Trooper Alfano?
The only reference I have of Trooper Alfano was the blur to my left. After the initial shot, I saw him begin to move backwards, which I assume was towards the cover of a vehicle.
What happened? Could you hear what was being said?
I couldn't hear anything at that time except gunshots.
What happened next?
I was able to put down fire as the vehicle accelerated heavily through this parking lot. I was able to follow the vehicle visually and fire more rounds safely until the vehicle hit an awning, which is used for vehicles to park so they can register into the hotel. At that point, I could not safely fire without risking hitting a building or another object, so I could not shoot any further once the vehicle reached its awning.
Where did the vehicle go?
At that point, I completely lost sight of the vehicle.
Where was your focus then?
I immediately put out my radio traffic that I'd been involved in a shooting, and I looked to where I believe Trooper Casey would be, and I saw him laying down on the ground. His body was facing south, so his legs were closer towards me and his head was farther away from me. He was lying on his back, motionless.
What did you do?
I ran up to Trooper Casey, and I knew he was dead at that moment. But
Your body was dead at that moment.
due to the fact of my training and my medical training, and I just completed EMT schooling earlier that year, I felt if he had any chance to survive whatsoever, I was probably his best choice. So I ran up to him and I straddled his body, and I was looking at his face, and initially I could just see a little bit of blood on his face, and I noticed that his eyes were open, but they were completely rolled back, and he had what we refer to as coded, which he did not have a pulse, and he was not breathing at that moment.
What did you do?
So I knew that the survival rate for a headshot is incredibly low, and the last thing I wanted to do was move him in case there's any neck trauma. So I put my hands around his head because I was trying to feel for an exit wound, or what I would refer to as mush. If I felt mush, that meant the back of his head had exploded away. He would not survive. I was feeling for an exit wound. I was screaming his name out over and over again, Casey, Casey, on the sheer hope that if he was dead or dying, that maybe he could hear me. Probably about the third or fourth time I yelled his name, he let out a grunt, which in the police world we refer to as death gasp. A lot of people, when they pass away, their body releases air and gas inside their body, and they make one last moan or groan.
Did you think that was a death gasp?
I believed that was a death gasp, and I just heard his last. I believed I just heard his last breath in front of me as I was holding him. So I gently started to move his shoulders. Once again, I didn't want to risk hurting him anymore. So I started pushing down on his shoulders, tried to gently shake him while I screamed his name a few more times.
What were you trying to do in that moment?
I was hoping I'd bring him back. I hope he still had enough vitals active that he could hear me and come back. After shaking him probably 3 or 4 times, his eyes rolled forward and he looked at me. I said, Casey, can you hear me? And he mumbled a yes.
What happened next?
The immediate sense of relief vanished because I heard tire screeching come from directly behind me. My initial thought was that's too quick for backup officers to get here, so I turned around to look. I looked over my left shoulder towards the frontage road, and I saw the blue vehicle exiting the driveway, which at that moment I thought was a side street that was located behind the hotel. But it was the driveway for the rear of the hotel.
Was it the same blue car?
I looked at the vehicle and it was the same color, and I thought to myself, that's the same fucking car. And right as I thought that to myself, I heard gunshots start coming from the vehicle. With the gunshots, I saw smoke coming from where I could hear the gunshots. And the smoke was coming from the rear of the vehicle on the passenger side, behind the driver, the same area where I believe the first shot had come from.
Were the windows on the passenger side still up?
Yes, both windows on the passenger side, the front and back, both windows were still in the up position. So I believed it was the same person shooting that I'd heard shoot before. So I went to get off Trooper Casey because I didn't want any rounds directed at me to now hit Trooper Casey, who's lying on the ground and cannot help himself. As I went to move away, I slightly tripped, which caused me to spin around. At this point, the vehicle has now completed its turn and is now coming southbound on the frontage road. And I perceived it to begin to slow down. Meanwhile, I'm still hearing gunshots coming at me. So I believe the vehicle was possibly slowing down to have a better angle to shoot at me. So I took a kneeling position and began to fire back at the vehicle. However, after 2 to 3 rounds, I realized I was also completely exposed now, sitting in the middle of this parking lot.
What did you do?
So at that point, I stood up and began to run in a west direction where all the vehicles are parked for the people staying at the hotel. After 5 to 8 steps, I realized I had too much ground to cover before I would be able to seek proper cover, and I did not want to take a round to the back of the vest. So I turned around and ran sideways towards my vehicle and began to fire as I ran sideways to the cover of my vehicle.
What happened? Where did the vehicle go?
So the vehicle, from my point of view, appeared to have slowed down to right about the point where Trooper Casey had been laying. And then at that moment, it accelerated heavily and continued southbound on the frontage road towards McDowell Road, at which point I lost sight of it again due to the awning from the building, the awning from the hotel building.
What did you do now after the second shooting I hear?
So I was fearful that that vehicle was going to come back for a third time. So I ran back out to Trooper Casey after I put out the radio traffic that they had come back a second time. Trooper Alfano ran out with me, and I yelled at Alfano to grab Casey's feet. I told him we're going to do a body drag. In the Marine Corps, or in a combat situation with all the gear on, it's very hard to pick up somebody who's collapsed. So I asked Trooper Alfano to just grab his legs. I grabbed Trooper Casey by his shoulders, and we half carried him and half dragged him towards the west side of my vehicle. I wanted to have the cover of my vehicle in case that vehicle came back a third time.
And you did that?
We were able to successfully move him over, at which point I told Trooper Alfano to keep an eye out for the vehicle so I could begin attempting first aid on Trooper Casey again.
Was Trooper Casey communicating?
He did not say anything during the body drag. Once he was laying on the ground, he did have his eyes open and did appear to be conscious still.
Did he say something about his ability to breathe?
I asked Trooper Casey, the first thing I said to him was, "Do you know you've been shot?" He replied, "Yes." I said, "I know you're in pain. I need to know what hurts you the most." And he said, "I cannot breathe." At which point, I had him open his mouth. And when I looked inside his mouth using my flashlight, I saw what was a combination of blood, cartilage, and broken teeth stuck in his throat, which was choking him. Somebody was on scene at this point. I do not know who that officer was, and said, "We need to move him so he can get rid of that, so he doesn't choke himself to death." I said, "No, we can't. We can't move him. We can't let him move. He might break something in his head. So we got to roll him." So we gently grabbed him, held his neck, and we half rolled him over. I was still wearing my patrol gloves. They're not protected for biohazard, but there were gloves, and it didn't matter. So I held the gloves a couple inches away from his mouth, and I told Casey to spit it out, man, just spit it out. And he attempted to spit out all that blood and teeth and cartilage out so he could breathe again through his mouth.
Did you attempt to look for other gunshot wounds on Trooper Casey?
I did not. I was just focused on his mouth at that moment.
At that point, were you also taking command of the radio and the scene?
Yes, I was on the radio to try to organize the units that were arriving so we could shut down the road, because I knew we would have evidence that would be run over on that frontage road if we didn't collect it. I also requested fire personnel to arrive on scene and position the arriving troopers. I believe the next two troopers on scene were Trooper Leyva and Trooper Roadcap. I asked them to set up, need to correct that. When they arrived on scene, they set up security on their own.
Did fire arrive?
When fire arrived, the first unit that arrived was actually engine, a fire engine. They can't transport. So the engineer, which is usually the firefighter that sits in the passenger seat, jumped out and came running towards us. I informed him that Trooper Casey wasn't bleeding out, but he needed to be transported immediately. The firefighter ran back to grab a backboard to prep Casey for, to transport Casey. At which time myself and Trooper Alfano began to take off Trooper Casey's gun belt and remove his vest. Trooper Casey also wore an outer carrier, which is, as I explained earlier, it's a bulletproof vest, but with DPS we insert it inside another shirt, so it appears that we're wearing a shirt on the outside. So I began removing, with the help of Alfano, those two items.
You maintain control of the radio traffic for about 7 minutes?
Yes, I maintained what's called command of the scene. I mean, I was the only one on the radio until my sergeant arrived at some point. I was still on the radio, and about approximately 7 minutes into this, my voice broke. Realized I was losing my mental control, so I just stopped talking on the radio, and I next heard my sergeant take over.
Trooper Casey was taken to the hospital, right?
Correct.
You stayed on scene,
I stayed on scene.
and within 4 to 5 hours, you did what's called a walkthrough, correct?
Yes.
Could you tell us what a walkthrough is very briefly?
So after the shooting, I was sequestered. That means they put me inside a command van so I wouldn't speak to anybody else.
Is that standard when an officer has to discharge his firearm?
Yes.
In every single case, that's the protocol?
Yes, it is.
And you did that?
They did that. They kept me by myself until all the detectives had assembled and prepared to walk the scene. What that means in the police world is I'm going to walk all the detectives present step by step as into the events of what happened. And we literally walk from point to point, and I explained everything that happened at each step of the way.
You answered all their questions?
Yes, I did.
And that was recorded?
Yes, it was.
And that was with Detective Jan Butcher and Anthony Mraz of the Phoenix Police Department
Yes, it was.
and other people?
Yes.
May I approach? You may.
Counsel, actually, could I ask you both to approach? Thank you. We are going to take a brief break. You will go back to the jury room. Please remember the admonition applies during all breaks. We'll see you in a moment.
All rise for the jury.
Sir, you may leave the witness stand.